Hello and welcome to another episode of ACRP TV. Today our spotlight is on real-world challenges facing virtual trials. Of course, with COVID, virtual trials have come very much into vogue in the last few months. They've been doing some amazing things. There have also been a lot of big promises made out there, and we're lucky we've got a great guest with us today, Paul Evans, who's the president and CEO of Velocity Clinical Research. He's also the chairman of the board for ACRP and our board of trustees. So I've had the chance to work with Paul quite a lot over the last couple of years, and has always been a big help to me on clinical researcher articles, CRB blogs, and so much else. But Paul, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us first off.
My pleasure, Michael. It was great to be with you.
Let's jump right in now. You've got 12 sites. Let's talk about your experience as in the last few months as COVID hit, and some people in an optimistic way would say, hey, let's flip a switch and just make this a virtual trial. How did that go for you?
Well, I think like everybody, it was, we were flying by the seat of our pants a little bit. It was a bit scary. COVID, nobody saw coming, and we suddenly had to scramble and get things done. You know, one of the first impressions was how collaborative everyone was, you know, from the regulators like FDA, MHRA. You know, they were very quick and very helpful with the guidance that they put out around some of these things when we suddenly found we were going to have to work in these different modalities. Sponsors were extremely collaborative and you know, certainly worked with us to find solutions that were practical, even if sometimes they were difficult. And patients were great. Patients adopted this approach very easily indeed. Everybody knew that things had changed, and we were going to have to adapt. So it was a great collaborative experience. I think that was the first thing. I think, though, the overwhelming impression was just how unprepared we were for this. You know, we've been talking about whether you call them virtual trials or patient-centric trials. We've been talking about this for a long time, yet when push came to shove and we had to use them, we were singly unprepared to take them on. So there was a lot of scrambling. Certainly where we used tech, it was a challenge. There were a lot of tech systems out there. Not all of them were secure, and a lot of people will have seen some of the stories that were out there about systems being hacked and people breaking into meetings. So just because the tech was there from a day-to-day use, you know, we might have been able to use them to speak to family on the other side of the world, but it wasn't necessarily suitable for patients. So the tech wasn't necessarily all there. I mean, our staff had to flex and suddenly get used to technology they hadn't previously used. And remember, this was all going on at a time when sites generally were much quieter. Most recruiting studies, 80–90% of them, stopped recruiting. Now, for your average site, that's probably 2/3 of the workload right there had gone away. So they were able to focus on seeing patients through existing patients on existing trials. And what we didn't really try to do in the main through this crisis was recruit new patients onto new trials. That probably would never have worked. I'm not saying nobody managed to do that, but largely we didn't do that. And so the sites were dealing with this problem with probably around 1/3, 40% of their normal workload. So, you know, we had some breathing space to do it. And I think, you know, in the main, the other thing that struck me about all this was that, you know, the sites got to choose their own tech very early on. Sponsors and CROs would come to us and say, you know, how are you set up to do this? Do you have an SOP around this? You know, they were information gathering. How would you do it? And so if we had a solution, which we very often did, then they would allow us to pursue that. So unlike most of what we see in terms of tech rollouts, a lot of this was site chosen rather than sponsor chosen. So that probably made it a little easier for the sites as well.
And we're talking here, it's June 4th, so we're still in the midst of this. Maybe, hopefully, when the history of this is written, we'll look back and think we're past the crisis, the worst of the crisis point, but who can say? But can you talk about some of the lessons you learned along the way up to now?
Yeah, and I think, you know, as you say, we're still in the early stages, the early days. We're just coming out the other side of COVID-19 and beginning to lift our eyes to the horizon again, as you say. I think one of the very first lessons I've learned from all this is that, of course, you can't just take a different methodology, again, whether you call it virtual, remote, patient-centric, you can't just take that sort of methodology and overlay it on a protocol that was never designed to operate that way. So I think one of the most important things we've learned is if we're really going to make use of this modality, then we're going to have to fundamentally rethink some of the protocols that are being written around our industry. Some of the research that Ken Getz and his group do extremely well, shows us that protocols have got increasingly complex over the last 2 decades. It never seems to reverse. Just when you think they can't get more complicated, Ken's data shows us.
One more question, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the attitude is, wouldn't it be nice to have this data, or maybe we can include this as one of the outcomes or one of the objectives. And protocols have gone that way over the last 2 decades. To try and overlay, this type of modality now on top of that's going to be really difficult. You have to strip those back and start with a protocol that is appropriate to this style of working. So the way we write protocols has fundamentally got to change. It's not just take the approach or the technology and overlay it on something we've always done. That doesn't work. So that's a big mindset change, because we spent 20 years going in the opposite direction, and now we've got to try and reverse. So that's not going to be so easy to do. I think one of the other things we've learned is that we don't want to overburden the CRCs with tech in particular. And I do worry about that, because as an industry, we're very good at rolling out new technology solutions. And sometimes I feel, well, that's a solution looking for a problem. So just because it's a technological way of doing something doesn't mean it's a good idea or a good way to do it.
Or there's not enough training behind it sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and in isolation, a solution may look great, but then when you put it in a study on top of everything else that we're having to do in the study, it doesn't necessarily make sense. So I worry about overburdening coordinators, because certainly what will happen is that patients will view the coordinator as the first line help desk, even if in future we give them a help desk to go to. That first point of call is always going to be the coordinator. So the role of the coordinator is going to subtly change. And the coordinator themselves are going to have to be far more tech savvy, because that's what they're going to be called on to do. So, we do need to think about how we train and how we support coordinators to do this job and do it well. And the other thing, interestingly, Michael, that I think we learned from this experience is actually the reverse almost of what we're talking about here. And that is that patients actually like to come to sites. Now that we're beginning to reverse things and bring patients back into sites, or patients are beginning to, I should put it, patients are feeling more confident and willing to come back to site, what we're hearing from them when they come in is how great it is to be able to come back in and see the team and meet patients, clinicians face to face. So, while you hear a lot of talk about, and I completely agree with it, you hear a lot of talk about it would be, this type of modality would be a good way for us to engage with more patients that find it difficult to get to site, or can't commit to the number of visits we want, or live too far away. That's absolutely right. And that's the plus side. But let's not suggest that everything is a negative about going to site. And patients like to come to site and see people face to face. So we do need to think about that too. So those are the 3 main lessons I think we've learned from this experience over the last few months.
All right, last question. I appreciate your time here, Paul. You hear people talk a lot about the COVID catalyst, how COVID is changing the way we've been operating in the clinical trial world and in other areas, of course, too. And it certainly has had an impact. Do you think it's a lasting impact? I mean, do you think a year from now, we're going to be, are virtual trials here to stay, or have we totally changed our mindset? Or what do you think?
Do you know, that's a really good question, because of course at the moment, we're still living with this black swan event. This is a pandemic. Hopefully, we won't see for another 100 years. So most of us dealing with this now are not going to have to deal with another one like it. And of course, when you're in the middle of something like this, everyone thinks everything has changed, and a lot has changed. I do worry, though, about whether, once we are out the other side, and we will be, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and we will be through this one day. Memories can be short, and I think people will then start to revert to type a little bit. And as an industry, what I worry about is that we actually aren't that quick to adapt or adopt new ways of working. I'm old enough to remember the rollout of EDC technology in this industry. And of course that took, probably the best part of 2 decades for us to truly adopt that technology and use it to the point where it's now routine. So when you look at things that we do that are new in this industry, we tend to be a little bit slow to do it. So I do worry about that, and whether we'll slide back into old ways because it'll be easy. And of course, as I said earlier, the protocols that we need to really adopt this type of modality are not there yet. They weren't written, or they aren't written yet for this type of approach. So it's going to take a little while. It's not this generation of protocols. It's what we do with the next generation of protocols that will change things. So I'm not one of those people that believes that the change is A, permanent, or B, now nailed on, because I do think we have challenges to get some of this change ingrained in the way that we work. I think that's just the nature of what we do. So I think what we're looking at, and I do worry about some of the breathless commentators I see out there saying that everything's changed. Yeah, everything's changed, but I think we're living with evolution, not revolution. So I still don't expect that we'll move quickly down this path. I think it'll be more measured than that.
Excellent. We've been speaking here with Paul Evans, who's the president and CEO of Velocity Clinical Research. He's also the chair of the ACRP Board of Trustees. Paul, I really want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael. It's always a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
It's been another episode of ACRP TV, our spotlight on real-world challenges facing clinical trials. We'll see you next time.